You caught me. I was indeed sniffing graphs. I listened to over 400 IEMs and I had my own collab as well, so I wanted to share my experience, specifically how you can read them to better, make an educated guess when you're trying to buy an IEM. But first, let's go over what each region does to the sound when you change it. It gives you a better understanding of the fundamentals. In the sub-bass region, which is usually under 60 Hz, this is where you get all your bass rumble and that shaking and vibrating feeling in your chest, and how deep and powerful the sub-bass extends and hit. An example of this would be the Fat Freak HPB Deuce, which has a pretty big boost when it comes to the sub-bass, slightly scooped to control the sub-bass from getting in the way of the lower mids. Then at around 60 to 250 Hz, this is the bass region. This is where the infamous scoop occurs, which can make the vocals and the overall sound thinner or muddier depending on how much you boost or scoop. An example of this would be the infamous moondrop variations. To a lot of people, the mid-bass scoop makes it sound thin, whereas if you have too much of the hump in the 250 Hz area, then it's going to sound muddy, it's going to sound unnatural and a bit congested. Then moving up to the lower mids from around 250 to 500 Hz, this is where you get the slam, the impact, and the satisfying hit from the drum section. It's also where the majority of the clarity and the texture comes from when it comes to bass guitars, as well as other rhythmic section instruments. It influences how warm or thick an IEM can sound. If you have too much of this, it could be a little bit too meaty, a little bit too much bloat, a bit too warm and overly colored when it comes to the lower mids, whereas when you don't have enough, it just sounds a bit clinical and a bit cold. Then moving up to the mid-range, which is anywhere from 500 to 2000 kHz, this is where you would find your acoustic guitars, your cellos, your pianos, your viola, brass, woodwinds. Overboosting under 1000 will make the instruments feel honky, unnatural, congested, while boosting the 1 to 2K region will heavily influence how forward and how recessed the vocal feels in the overall playback. For example, the 1 to 2K is where the infamous vocal hump occurs. This results in the vocals being too shouty, a bit overboosted, a bit too forward in your face, while a flatter 2K on the other hand results in the vocals to be a bit too recessed, a bit inaudible, detached, and lacking in the overall power and immersion. And as for the upper mids region around 2 to 4K, this is where we see a boost in the presence and the clarity when it comes to the vocals and a sharper attack from the instruments. When overboosted, the sound results in like a fatiguing and sharp attack to the transients, and when there's not enough, the overall sound feels a bit hollow, a bit low res, and the vocals in particular feels not fully extended and not fully opened. An example of this region getting cut or underboosted would be the Performer 5+2, resulting in a bit like more laid back and recessed vocal presentation. And then something that's overboosted would be the KZ PR2, which is just a bit too shouty. Then moving past 4K to 8K, this is where the early treble occurs, which influences how crisp and how sizzly an IEM sounds. Too much of this results in an overly bright and harsh sound, unnatural, while not having enough makes an IEM sound a bit dark and a bit low res in the overall resolution. The new Tangzu Wuzitia Legend Edition would be an example of something that is just overboosted, while the Full Explorer is an example of something darker. However, something darker can still sound pretty balanced if you give it more volume and scaling, which we will talk about later. And then finally, past 2K to 20K and above, this is where the air and the sparkle happens, as well as that last bit of refinement in most of the IEMs when it comes to micro nuances and details, especially if you use ESTs. Too much of this region can make the sound overly airy, a bit hissy, shrill, while not having enough air makes the IEM feel lacking in the micro details, and it feels a bit more cramped and a smaller sense of headspace because you don't have that airy and open sensation. An example of overboosting and negatively affecting the timbre would be the brain damage with the excess boost in the treble, and then something that's dark and feels more cramped in the staging would be something like the IMR Elon. Now, what does this all mean? Well, by comparing the FR from a graph to example Harman 2019, which is more balanced and more universally known, with this context in hand, we can then estimate how an IEM sounds with very high accuracy without even hearing it. For example, if you have an IEM that is boosted in the 4K, 6K, and 10K plus regions while having like a lower bass shelf, then we can accurately estimate that the IEM will most likely sound sharper, brighter, more sparkly, more airy, while probably also being very detailed, but also potentially shouty because there is more focus and boost in the upper mids and treble region. Whereas on the other hand, if we have the same graph, but now the graph just has more low end, the sound becomes more quote-unquote balanced out because the upper mids and the treble is now less in focus due to the additional presence from the extra low end. So even though the amount of treble and upper mids have not changed, now they just feel less prominent and less in your face, less focused with our attention because it gets hidden more by the additional bass that kind of, balances out the sound. It's like when you have a little bit too much salt in your food, but you can't really take out the salt, so instead you just add a little bit sugar, a little bit vinegar to kind of try to like hide the excess salt flavor. It's kind of the same concept here. It might still be salty, but at least now you notice it less because the vinegar and the sugar is now kind of distracting your tongue. Same logic here. The treble isn't going anywhere, but it's just you perceive it less because of the bass kind of stands out a bit more. An example of this would be the moondrop variations. If you look at the graph, the vocals around 1 to 3K doesn't seem too boosted. It's still around Harmon, but in reality, when you listen to the variations, it sounds a lot more thin and a lot more shoutier. And the reason for this is not only because the scoop makes the sound a bit thinner by default, but the difference in contrast is now much bigger if you count the bottom of the scoop and the top of the gain of the 3K, which highlights the vocals even more than versus something with something less scooped and less gain, where the sound is closer relatively to one another, with the other regions popping out less. For example, if you measure the variations at the top of the gain versus the bottom of the scoop, the difference in the dB variance is much bigger when you compare it to something like the original EJ07s, which is much closer when you measure from the top and the bottom. So then the question becomes, how do you make something balanced? Well, you need to have the same levels of boost when it comes to the y-axis. This means the maximum amount of bass should match the maximum amount of treble and upper mids when it comes to the peak volume. Basically, if you put a straight line over your graph, both should be around the same level on the y-axis. So if you put a line at the maximum peak of the upper mids on the punch, you can see how the bass is a lot more, and that really helps shift your focus onto the low end. Basically, any region that peaks out and looks over the other regions will be more forward when it comes to the overall playback and more in focus comparatively to the other regions. Which is why flatter sounds tend to do better when it comes to the perception of layering and separation, because the instruments and vocals are laid out at the same distance. And if they're all laid out at the same distance, if you look at this way, none of them are kind of like popping out and overshadowing the other, which is why you can kind of like pick out the instrument details better. Now, if you have a lot of these picks and really big ones as well, it's gonna cause fatigue when it comes to the overall playback because it just pops out too much, as well as it's gonna hide some details because again it's overshadowing the other regions underneath it. Now, another way to balance IEM is via the x-axis and making sure there is enough room across the x-axis so no regions are kind of like squished together with one another. An example of this would either be delaying the 1 to 2K regions or kind of scooping out the 1 to 2K to create more space for the low end. A lot of bass head IEMs use this because they want to have the maximum amount of bass as much as possible, but if they make it too close to the 1 to 2K boost, then the vocals are gonna kind of get buried by the bass. It's gonna sound muddy, it's gonna sound congested and unnatural because there's just not enough space. A general rule of thumb is that you kind of want to have the mid bass fix itself and becomes like straighter, ideally back around 350 to 400 Hz and at the latest around 500 Hz. For the most part, the dome looks pretty shouty if you just look at the graph because there's a lot of 1 to 2K region, but it actually doesn't sound overly shouty because of the spacing when it comes to the x-axis. If you look at the graph, they decrease the vocal gain after 2000 kHz, so even though there is a bump in the 1 to 2K region, because the later frequencies after it are decreased and not boosted, they don't stack up and they don't make the sound overly shouty, because if you had the 1 to 2K bump and then proceeded to also boost the 3 to 4K region, if you add those two together, it's going to be overly shouty. Another example is if you have an upper mids boost in the 4 to 8K regions, you then need to decrease or to maintain the FR smoothly right afterwards so it doesn't stack up and destroy the overall balance. For example, the EM6L does a very good job of this. It boosts the upper mids more to highlight that region to give it a more bright sound, but it still maintains the smooth sound signature because it doesn't have huge peaks, huge dips, and then it also drops off later when it comes to treble and doesn't just continue all the way through, which will make the sound a bit too bright. Now, many audiophiles chase the smoothest and kind of straightest line possible so that there's no peaks, there's no dips, dips that can kind of occur to create masking or, sharpness to the sound, which makes a lot of sense on paper, and it does check out pretty well in real life as well. However, even though it will sound smoother, if you do take out the peaks and dips, you also take out the contrast in the sound as well. This means the IEM is going to sound less dynamic, it's going to sound less fun, less exciting, because if the entire graph is just flat relatively to one another, then nothing is really kind of standing out and popping out, and the sound just becomes a little bit too boring. So what you end up getting is a sound that is acceptable, it's good, it's inoffensive, it's gonna work for most people, it's gonna work for most library, and it's pretty balanced overall. But this doesn't mean it's gonna increase the enjoyment when it comes to the overall musicality or the overall immersion. It just eliminates most potential downsides, but it doesn't necessarily increase your enjoyment. It's kind of like having all your stats balanced out at around 80 out of 100, which is really good, but none of them are really reaching that 100 out of 100. None of them are the best in their given areas, and it just doesn't hit the same if you have a set that specializes in one particular region. However, there is one IEM that actually does the balance sound very good, but at the same time it adds in its own kind of like unique flavor. It's still dynamic, it still has that little bit of contrast, and that IEM is unfortunately the SUBTONIC Storm. And I say unfortunately because it costs over $5,000. Yes, it is very expensive, and I wouldn't recommend it to 99.9% of you guys watching, but it does deliver. It's balanced, but also adds in that dynamic and contrast sound to the overall music. It has the smaller peaks and dips, and in rapid succession, it doesn't like overshadow or create huge masking, or it doesn't cause any sharpness and fatigue because the contrast is very subtle. The peaks and dips are very small. They're not huge roller coaster, differences like the KZs, for example. So what you end up getting is you get your cake and you get to eat it too, but for $5,000. Now, the closest thing to the Storm at a more affordable price is the ZIIGAAT ODYSSEY. If you look at the graph, they actually look very similar. The Odysseys actually look smoother on the graph. However, it is less dynamic, less detailed, quote unquote less special. But it also costs 20 times less for like 80-85% of the sound and performance. So I also want to mention the tilt. So basically, draw a line from the highest region in the treble towards the highest region from the bass, and if there is a line that either tilts towards the treble or the bass, then you have a tilt. For example, if it tilts towards the upper mids or the treble, you have a more upper mids, brighter sound signature. Now, when it comes to scaling, I'm trying to figure out if an IEM scales very good just by looking at the graph. The general rule of thumb is that if an IEM have both a cut in the upper mids as well as like a cut in the treble section and not too much bass, then it's most likely going to scale very well. The Full Explorer is a pretty good example of this. It scales extremely well when you look at the graph. The upper mids are cut, the treble is downward leaning. It is more sub bass leaning because if you draw a line over it, the sub bass is over the other frequencies, which checks out when you listen to the Explorer. The Odysseys are also a good example of this, but instead of the sub-bass region being more in focus, the upper mids, the treble is a little bit more boosted, and the vocals pop out a bit more, so it scales a little bit better when it comes to the mid-range section. When you compare the Explorer and the Odysseys to Harman 2019, both of these have a much flatter vocal region and not too boosted when it comes to the treble. You still want a little bit of air in the treble because you don't want the sound to be kind of like closed in and not have that like open and airy feeling, but you do want the upper mids to be cut a bit more so the vocals don't destroy your ears when you turn the volume up. An example of an IEM that doesn't scale very well is the Variations, because it has a lot more boost when it comes to 1 to 3K region, and because of this boost, you can't really turn it up too much before it starts becoming shouty, since there's just a lot of ear gain already at mid volume before you even crank it. Basically, the more upper mids and treble it has, the closer it is to hitting the near maximum threshold when it comes to fatigue and scaling, while the other way around, if you have less of upper mids, less treble, then you have a bigger runway to kind of hit that threshold before things becoming too much. Furthermore, the balance of a graph also varies depending on the track, because if a song has no bass, then the upper mids and the treble are just gonna get highlighted a lot more than usual. This is why bright IEM sounds very good on certain songs and a bit too much on the others, because the low end that's essentially helping balance out the sound gets kind of removed on a different track that doesn't have that excess amount of bass, and as a result of that, the treble and the upper mids get pushed in your face a bit more, and just more forward, it's more highlighted, it's more obvious, creating a more, fatiguing sensation. This is why different tunings work with certain different type of songs. A general rule of thumb here is that you want the IEM to kind of balance out the part that's lacking in the track. For example, K-pop tracks have too much upper mids and too much treble in their productions, it's overly boosted. So in order to kind of balance that out, you want to find something that has less upper mids and treble when it comes to the sound, or something that has more bass, or better yet, a combination of both. Otherwise, if you go with a set that also has a lot of upper mids or treble, or doesn't have enough low end to kind of balance it out and hide the excess amount of upper mids and treble on the track, then it's just gonna stack up, it's gonna get overwhelming, it's gonna get fatiguing and very unenjoyable. Here are some examples I want you to try. Pause the video, take a guess, and comment below what you think the sound is. But aside from that, I hope this guide was helpful. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see everyone in the next one, which is hopefully the Meteor review, but it still hasn't shipped yet, so we'll see.
Shout out to Rorik's Cat, Dom Q, Discal Scotus, B Urac, Mystic Spoon Attack, Walker Standard, User Patrick, Polly J, Mr. Gorillas, Anton Risto, Gis Sang Young, Ed Dunlap, Christopher Jackson, Name, Henry Claudia, Son of a Horse, 777 ZK, Ben Thompson, Obi, Treble Well Extended, Wizard, Frickalicious, Andric, Ricardo, Tapas R, Chucko Norris, Oh Really, Contain Guava Juice Gains, Shrimp Buck Lee, Nico, Igris, and Forever New. Thank you guys so much for the year.